squeezed margins on what was traditionally a commodity business.
Awaken the giant within. And that giant within, to use Anthony Robbins' quote, is data.
360 view of that data, to have a single source of truth where all of the data from the different systems is actually consolidated.
Customers are actually wanting to engage more with their utility provider because they perceive them to be, a trusted advisor. Welcome back to The Reboot Show. I'm your host, Sally Illingworth. Today, we're joined by two utility industry experts and a visual analytics solution lead from Tableau to unpack the unprecedented transformation unfolding globally across utility markets and, in particular, energy retailing as new market entrants challenge the data maturity of incumbents. Our panelists will be discussing a range of things today, including the key drivers of disruption, the role of real-time data insight in maintaining competitive advantage, and the growing implications for executives in the industry beyond the ordinary pressures of regulation. Joining us today is Razia, who is a solution lead at Tableau, Delaney, who is the Energy and Utilities Industry Strategy Director at Salesforce, and of course, our resident technology panelist, Stow. To kick off, Joe, it'd be great to hear your insights on the current state of the utilities marketplace and views on the key drivers of disruption, both in Australia and internationally.
This is just a fantastic question, and there's so much to work with on this because it's difficult to imagine a more exciting time in any industry than the one facing us with the energy transition right now. Most people will be familiar with the all of the news coming out of COP26 recently, the dramatic shift from a global governance perspective towards net zero emissions, different places in different geographies, but that's married in turn by an increasingly rapid shift of global capital away from fossil fuel intensive industries towards more ESG related investments. And I think the latest information is something like $130 trillion of assets under management by if you listen to Mark Carney's latest information. That is phenomenal, a phenomenal shift of global capital towards low carbon industries and investments. Mm-hmm. So you've got that going on in parallel to what most people will be familiar with, the concept of the 3Ds, sort of decarbonisation, decentralisation and digitalisation, really encompasses the energy transition itself. Now, I prefer to call it like the 3Ds plus E, because the other aspect to all of this is widespread electrification of the economy. And when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, 75% roughly of global greenhouse gas emissions are caused by the energy sector, either directly in terms of electricity production or indirectly in terms of the big three end-use sectors of transportation, industry, and the built environment. So if you're going to get to this goal of net zero by 2050, and really this is the crucial decade in terms of making that impact, you have to find a way to effectively move through that timeline. So if I go back to the 3Ds, you're talking about decarbonisation. So you're talking about moving away from a centralised, traditional, large-scale sort of fossil fuel intensive generation, a one-way flow of electricity, to an increasingly decentralised and intermittent two-way form of electricity. And that is fundamentally disrupting grids everywhere, and also the financial markets that underpin them. So, whereas in the old day, supply was adjusted to meet the changing levels of demand, now you've got a situation with intermittency in renewables, where you're almost having to flip that on its head and adjust demand to meet supply. And that's really one of the great paradigm shifts that's going on here. So and really Australia is at the front line of this, and I think the world is watching how utilities and grid operators here are dealing with this dramatic shift. 3 million rooftop solar households now. So you're on a per capita basis, we are well ahead of the rest of the world. And I think something like 10 times on a per capita the nearest amount. That is incredibly disruptive in terms of things like sort of frequency control, voltage variation at a distribution level. All of these are big challenges for the utilities sector. And alongside this, you've got, the broader energy resilience topics of, climate change and extreme weather events are only going to be increasing as we look to try and mitigate over the next few years. So that fundamentally opens up question marks about the vulnerability of large centralized energy networks. And, we've seen disruptions both from weather events, but also from reliability issues. Fundamentally, then at a sort of, if you look at it from an energy retailer level, you're looking at squeezed margins on what was traditionally a commodity business. So how are you shifting to fill those squeezed margins and move more towards that sort of higher value cross-sector value-added services beyond traditional electricity and gas. So that is a big driver at the moment, obviously, and combined with that collapse of the traditional gentailer model, all of this influx of solar that I described earlier during the day is having an incredible impact on the prices on the wholesale electricity price, which in turn is, of course, undermining the profits of big traditional gentailers, as we've seen recently. So fundamentally, there is such a slew of coexisting challenges that are impacting the global and local energy markets all at the same time here. And there's the new business models that are going to be emerging, I think, are really exciting. And I know we'll talk to some of those as we go.
Yeah, I think it's I love your reference to coexisting challenges. I think that's a perfect way to sum it up. And it certainly sounds like there's a lot of disruption occurring in terms of, especially when you consider traditionally squeezed margins and then the global shift of capital that you mentioned. I think there's certainly a lot going on, and I'm sure it's keeping both executives and practitioners across the sector busy. That's for sure. And I'm also interested to hear more, but I think we'll touch on that later, around what you mentioned, Joe, about Australia being at the front line, at least on a per capita basis, surrounding solar. It'd be interesting to sort of hear whether or not there's other fronts that Australia may be leading on or be a good global example for. But Luke, I'm mindful that you've held various leadership roles across utility organisations in particular, and have done a lot around sort of supporting the planning of investment and regulation considerations. So based on what Joe's just shared with us about state of the market, both in Australia and globally, and the major disruption that's occurring, what do today's utilities leaders need to consider based on what Joe shared?
Well, Joe has really explained that, I think, in some detail, and I really enjoyed listening to it because I think really frames it well for what considerations boards and executives are having to consider now when they're thinking about how their business is going to operate in the future models with utilities. There's a couple of really key points that I wanted to bring out. One is that, this changing environment, I think, is an opportunity for utilities to really grasp the foundations of what it is that we want them to do. And I that I'm passionate about the consumer in this. And I think from a customer point of view, we all want to embrace fresh, clean energy. We see the debates rolling on, and I think it frustrates everyone that there is still, to my understanding, 55% of what is produced in Australia from an electricity point of view comes from coal, either black or brown. And, from a utility point of view, from a consumer, I can't really see in my light bulb that it's a clean energy electron that is lighting my bulb or not. So that's frustrating for us because we want clean energy. So that's first point. Second thing is I love the 3Ds. I think the last one, digital, is something I'm really passionate about. I often compare utilities for being data rich, but insight poor. And I think this is really quite key as they start to navigate their way through the next round of challenges. You know, information is available to utilities. They sit on a mountain of it. They've probably got more data and more understanding about what's going on in our environments, in our homes, in distribution networks, in environments than anyone else. And yet they have not awoken to this possibility that they can create a data culture within their environment and leverage tools like Tableau. And great to have Razia on this panel, because this is such an important factor in what utilities need to unlock. You know, we're going to see other players coming into this market. As we see Australian utilities now start to delve into, well, I might start providing health insurance and I might start providing telecommunications, internet. You're going to see some of the other respondents, like telecommunications companies, like the bigger firms from an oil and gas perspective, come into the market and say, well, I'm going to start providing electricity. And those companies have a history and a culture of making data-driven decisions, and utilities, quite frankly, don't. So they've got to awaken the giant within. And that giant within, to use an Anthony Robbins quote, is data. And as soon as they can get a hold of it and get the tools in their people's hands to be able to create the models of self-service and getting reports that are going to help them with the decisions they've got to make, you know, the better off they'll be and the better off we as consumers will be. And it's quite an exciting market. I love that, what Joe said. It is quite an exciting market because we're going to see change. It'll be forced change in some ways, because you'll either have to compete and win or die, or you will have to adopt because there'll be these other providers coming in that have got better retailing and better experience at using information to engage their clients and their B2B clients.
Yeah, I could just sort of come back on that, Luke. I think it's just such a fascinating area. You talked about some of these new entrants, and you know, I was just looking with the latest news on NL coming into the market initially in CNI, but quite clearly with the intention of getting into the residential retailing space as well. And you're talking about a global powerhouse there that brings something like 70 million existing retail customers, I think, globally. You know, they're not coming into it to be a bit part player here. You touched on, you look at the oil and gas super majors, big data-driven cultures there. With Shell's recently announced acquisition of PowerShop on the back of the CNI acquisition of ERM earlier. You know, you've got another big one there. You've got CBA as a bank investing, of course, in Amber Electric. So a lot going on there, and you've got a fintech like Bright. Also acquiring an electricity retailing license coming in next year as well. So I think it's not to mention, of course, Telstra itself, as you talked about. So huge new competitive pressures from organisations that have that that data-driven culture. So fully agree, Luke. Really exciting time.
And I think the retailing component that you've both been speaking to is really quite interesting, because I've certainly heard you speak a lot about, Luke, the fact that traditionally most consumers and customers, they didn't want to engage with the utility provider unless, because every time it was always about something negative, whether it's, an outage or a billing issue, or simply just a move and a relocation. So you need to, switch off one account and open a new one. But what I'm certainly sort of hearing from both of you is that as this disruption is occurring, perhaps customers are actually wanting to engage more with their utility provider because they perceive them to be, a trusted advisor around things relating to sustainability, for example. So although the consumer may not know that the energy coming through the light bulb, as to whether or not it's actually clean, but they still do want to be having, more connectivity with their providers so that they can at least understand what role they can play in terms of, trying to do better for the environment and the world. And I love, Luke, that you mentioned data rich, insight poor. I think that's a really key point of the discussion. And Razia, I'm sure you've got some views on this. When we think about data analytics pre-Tableau, What does that look like for most organisations if they don't have the capabilities of Tableau at their disposal? And how does Tableau actually transform the way that data can be analysed and shared and then leveraged to build competitive agility, as Luke and Joe have been speaking to?
Yes, Sally. So as Luke and Joe have mentioned, data is everywhere, and it's actually growing at really exponential rates on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis. And organizations are actually having a lot of difficulty tapping into the data to be able to uncover those insights and make informed business decisions. And there's actually several reasons for that. Traditionally, in the past, organizations have used more traditional BI methodologies. They've only provided access to analytics to select teams. Basically, that would be mostly in a lot of companies, IT teams that would be asked to build reports and to build dashboards. And while that may be good for certain companies, it all comes with a cost because the dashboards are actually built to not fully address the kind of questions that the business needs answered. And in addition to that, because there's so much data, data lives in so many different places. It lives in the power meters. It lives in the, smart meters. It lives in different devices. It lives in the cloud, in file systems. I could go on in terms of where all of this data lives. And in order for companies to be able to access this data, what they're finding is that they have to log on to all of these different multiple systems to connect to this data. And the issue that they're having is that all of these different systems require different tools to be able to connect to the data. And worse than that is actually not being able to have a 360 view of that data, to have a single source of truth where all of the data from the different systems is actually consolidated to provide that sort of information to the business users out there. And because of the delays or because of the tools that is currently being used to try to connect that data and have that information ready, a lot of the business users are actually making decisions without having that access to real-time data. So they're actually making decisions that are based on estimations or experience rather than the data in front of them. And where Tableau actually fits in with that is that Tableau provides an end-to-end platform for companies out there to basically provide self-service analytics tools to empower all users in an organization to connect to data, to explore their data, to be able to analyze that data and make those business decisions with current data in front of them. And additionally, users that are able to use Tableau for their own analysis can also leverage our different collaboration methods by sharing this information with other departments, with other users in the company to help, engage and drive that business strategy within an organization. And in terms of actually providing BI, self-service BI to employees, Tableau also has machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities that are directly built into the platform. And predictive analytics, I feel, is such a game changer for the utility industries. So they're able to actually be able to differentiate themselves in the market in order to personalize those customer interactions. And by providing customers with a view to their data and actually applying forecasting, analytics, trends to that particular data to project consumer consumption and compare that consumption with how customers like us want to see this data in comparison to our neighbors, in comparisons to people with similar housing demographics, is really helpful in utilizing and enhancing the customer experience. And all of this really helps to provide that customer engagement because customers are already used to this. And as we were mentioning, there are actually new key players in the market. So for the likes of Telstra, for example, Telstra already has a data strategy in place, right? It already has an existing customer base for their own products, and they can actually use that to, gain a successful entry into the market because they have a data culture, they have a strategy in place, and they have an existing customer base. And a lot of the new players that are actually emerging into that market also have gone through their data and digital transformation that unfortunately a lot of utility companies haven't. And so they've replaced their legacy platforms with more agile technology, helping them have access to that data and basically it's a pretty big threat to the energy companies out there.
Huge new competitive pressures from organizations that have that, that data-driven culture.
Said that data-driven organizations are 23 times more likely to acquire customers and 6 times more likely to retain customers.
It's very hard to uncouple the data from those very cluttered systems that have been in place for quite some time.
We believe that all of the data we have is in the Excel spreadsheets that we've populated it in, which is not the case, as you're highlighting.